Welcome everyone to this revision video on the character of Willie-Jay. Now, as a really interesting juxtaposition to the character of Dick, I think Willie offers an opportunity for salvation. He shows Perry that he could be the architect of his own destiny. He could become in control of his emotions. At the moment, he is allowing his emotions to dominate his life, make bad decisions for him, and he offers him a chance at redemption. We often see him as a mentor-like figure or a fatherly figure, someone to offer an alternative route to success. Not through crime, not through violence, anger, rage, or vengeance, but through understanding and through compassion and through finding value and purpose and belonging in your life. Now, the video is very much focused on In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, and it is designed for WJEC AS English Language and Literature. The reason why I think Willie-Jay is so important in the lead up to your exams is that he gives you a really interesting relationship to discuss. Now, if a question on relationships turned up, you could choose different types of relationships and how positive or negative they are. Now, I think the relationship between Dick and Perry is toxic. I think it's damaging. I think it's manipulative and exploitative. So if we were to take a look at Dick and Perry as a relationship, you'd probably talk about how unhealthy it is and how Dick is fully in control and he sees Perry as disposable once he's served his purpose. He sees something inside of Perry that he finds valuable, that can be exploited for his own self-gratification, and then Perry can be disposed of. Now, a perfect counterbalance to that would be the more healthy relationship we see with Willie-Jay. Willie-Jay is a character who offers a relationship of understanding and compassion, for seeing value inside of Perry and not seeking to exploit it, but seeking to give Perry a way of dealing with his emotions and so that he can start to find meaning in his life. Those are two relationships and they give us a nice balance in terms of what they tell us about the text. Now, I would pair this with a third relationship, and it's a relationship that is both loving and kind and sweet, but also unintentionally negative. And that might be the relationship between Nancy and Jolene at the start of the text. Whilst Nancy is kind and caring and she is a mentor-like figure, a little bit like Willie-Jay might be, she is unwittingly perpetuating the cycle of grooming young girls for domestication. I think those three relationships have something meaningful to say and can be tied together quite nicely in an exam. Now, Willie-Jay also fits in perfectly with the theme of masculinity. Now, there are a lot of masculine characters in the text. You've got Dick's very physical masculinity. You've got Perry's slightly more effeminate, but the overcompensation to try and attain a level of respect through his masculinity. You have Herb Clutter, who seems to be the epitome of masculinity itself. You've got Alvin Dewey, a masculine character who is also able to balance his masculinity with those domestic duties with his wife. I think Willie-Jay could be an interesting character for masculinity because whilst he is not masculine in the conventional sense, he is masculine in his intelligence and his wisdom. And I also think that Willie-Jay fits in perfectly with the theme of redemption. I think Perry is the type of character we could describe as missed potential. I think had Willie-Jay been able to have an influence on Perry in the way that he had planned, perhaps Perry could have been diverted from his path of criminality. So Willie-Jay is seen as a really positive character in the text. First of all, he does see value in Perry. He sees the diamond inside. He sees the creativity, the artist, the poet. And I think he feels tragic that that is all going to be masked by the anger he has inside of him. He offers support and guidance. He doesn't turn his back on Perry when Perry says that he isn't religious and he doesn't believe in God. He isn't there purely to convert. He is there to help his fellow human, and I think that's an important characteristic. And he really does seem to try and bring Perry into understanding why he is the way he is. Now, there's a lot to be said about Willie-Jay, almost like a psychologist or a psychiatrist. Willie-Jay wants Perry to understand that there are motivations behind his behavior, because through understanding, perhaps he can become in control of those emotions rather than acting in a volatile or reactionary way. Now, one of the things I really like about Willie-Jay is that he opposes Dick's willingness to trick Perry with illusions and dreams. Willie-Jay is trying to bring Perry away from his fantasies so that he can begin to live in the real world, whilst Dick is willing to stoke them. He's willing to fuel those false versions of success through dreams so that he can get Perry to do what he wants. Now, the character is brought up in a few different places. I'd like to focus on those first mentions of Willie-Jay between pages 39 and 43. I'm going to go from the part of the paragraph that begins with the reason was that several weeks earlier he had learned that on Thursday, and all the way up to waiting for Dick to emerge with a pair of black stockings. There are other mentions of Willie-Jay later on in the text, but this is the one I'd like to focus on for this essay. Now, as we go through, to make this as easy as possible, I'll read parts of the paragraphs first, and then I'll give you a little bit of analysis, hopefully with literary and linguistic terminologies being made really explicit, with the analysis of language, and also, where appropriate, I'll try and bring in some connections and links to contextual factors or contextual issues that will help to illuminate the text. The reason was that several weeks earlier he had learned that on Thursday, November the 12th, another of his former cellmates was being released from Kansas State Penitentiary at Lansing, and more than anything in the world, he desired a reunion with this man, his real and only friend, the brilliant Willie-Jay. I'm going to color coordinate the analysis so it's easier for you to take notes as we go through. Now, the first thing I really wanted to mention here is the word another there, I think is really important, because we have two characters placed right next to each other. They met in the same place, they have similar experiences, they both have a criminal background, and yet these two people almost form a choice. The choice is between Dick, the more nefarious criminal, and Willie-Jay, the criminal who regrets his actions and wants to support other people. Now, the fact that they are both former cellmates shows that there used to be a bond between those characters, and the word another gives us this sense of choice or a sense of decision. Now, where he says more than anything in the world he desired a reunion with this man, you can probably see that there is a lexical set of longing and connection. You know, the words desired and reunion and friend and cellmates all create a sense of fraternity. Now, it looks like Perry really wants to meet up with Willie-Jay again. They clearly had a good relationship in prison, and he wants to engage in that relationship outside of prison too. Now, where it says more than anything in the world, it really shows that he values Willie-Jay and his personality really, really highly. Because it looks like Willie-Jay offers Perry something that perhaps Dick doesn't. From the phrase more than anything in the world, you can see that Willie-Jay would be the first choice, and Dick is perhaps the fallback choice. Now, at the end of that line, Willie-Jay's appear, and I think Capote deliberately uses Willie-Jay's name at the end of the line to create that end focus. Now, for me, finishing it with Willie-Jay almost gives it a sense of high respect, of reverence, almost like this God-like figure, this Christ-like figure that could offer him salvation. And Willie-Jay is described using the pre-modifying adjectives real, in real and only friend, and brilliant. Now, the pre-modifying adjective real really gives us this sense of authenticity. It suggests that Willie-Jay is an authentic friend, and as a result, we could deduce that if Willie-Jay is authentic and real, then Dick must not be real. Dick seems to be the more superficial or fake friend. Willie-Jay is the one that offers him real truth. Now, the word brilliant again shows that he respects him very, very highly. Now, brilliant can give us some imagery of light, I guess. If something is brilliant, it's a very light image. But brilliant also gives us this image of intelligence and insightfulness and perception. I think Willie-Jay really gives Harry something to respect intellectually, whilst Dick is given respect for his physicality. So I think there's a clear difference between the physical presence of Dick and the more intellectual presence of Willie-Jay. During the first of his 3 years in prison, Harry had observed Willie-Jay from a distance, with interest but with apprehension. If one wished to be thought a tough specimen, intimacy with Willie-Jay seemed unwise. He was the chaplain's clerk, a slender Irishman with prematurely grey hair and grey, melancholy eyes. His tenor voice was the glory of the prison's choir. Even Perry, though he was contemptuous of any exhibition of piety, felt upset when he heard Willie-Jay sing the Lord's Prayer. The hymn's grave language, sung in so credulous a spirit, moved him, made him wonder a little at the justice of his contempt. I'd like to start off with the dynamic verb observed, and then the imagery of desire, but also of warning and of hesitation. Now, where it says Perry had observed Willie-Jay, it really shows that Perry has become interested in this person, perhaps because they're different, or perhaps because they're worthy of attention. Now, where it says distance, it shows that there's a reason why Perry doesn't try and get too close, which we'll discuss in a second. And interest and apprehension, I think those two are in juxtaposition. Perry both wants and wants to stay away. Now, the fact that there is a distance between the two characters and Perry is very much looking at Willie-Jay, it creates a sense of admiration. He's being admired from afar, and also that sense of reverence and respect. Now, if you take a look at what's in green, we then move on to language I think that is associated very much with masculinity. The lexis changes. Because when he says, if one wished to be thought a tough specimen, here you can see that Perry is considering his own reputation. Now, we know that Perry likes to be seen in a particular way. He's very, very conscious of how he is perceived by other characters. Now, the word tough, I think that shows that imagery of masculinity, that any sign of weakness must be eliminated, and that you need to put on this superficial facade of strength and almost being closed off to your emotions. Now, I think the word specimen is a particularly interesting word because it really does show that Perry is almost considering himself like livestock, like a bull, like some sort of animal that is considered less an individual but more of something to be held up with respect. Now, in blue I've placed intimacy and the word unwise, because intimacy with Willie-Jay seemed unwise. Now, I think we've got an illusion here that it isn't sensible for men in the prison to get too close to Willie-Jay, and you've got the word wise, and it is modified by the prefix un to show that those people who understand the way the world works will understand that distance is better than intimacy with this man. Now, there is a clear allusion here to the fact that perhaps Willie-Jay's sexual preferences, they don't necessarily conform to the heteronormative expectations of the 1950s and the 1960s. Now, the almost unacceptable view of being homosexual at this time is probably being alluded to. Now, even though Perry is quite effeminate, and there are lots of hints throughout the text that he does have those homosexual urges, you've got this clear decision for Perry at first to stay away, because he understands that in order to be tough, it means you need to stay away from intimacy with particular types of men. Now, as a job, Willie-Jay inside the prison is the chaplain's clerk, so he is a religious figure. He is somebody who helps the chaplain of the prison, and he is described physically as prematurely grey. Now, prematurely is the premodifying adverb here, the adverb that describes the adjective, and it creates this almost godlike figure. Now, you've got grey, which maybe connotes wisdom and intelligence here. This is someone who has lived a life. This is someone who has experienced life, and as a result has garnered lots of knowledge and lots of understanding on his travels. And he also has melancholy eyes. Now, melancholy is a sense of sadness. Now, perhaps there's a sense of sadness because he's disappointed in the decisions that he's made in life, or he takes on the problems of others and he internalizes them himself. Now, you could consider the melancholy eyes to be the types of eyes that Jesus would have, a sense of sadness in them. And I think the imagery, it's almost biblical imagery of a godlike or a Jesus-like figure, are there deliberately. And you'll see that image in a couple of slides' time when Perry actually paints the figure of Jesus with the eyes of Willie-Jay. Now, after that, his voice is described as a tenor voice, and it was the glory of the prison's choir. Now, you've got this idea that it is his voice that is most important about this character. If it came to Dick, perhaps there are physical attributes that are more impressive. But for this character, it is his voice that is most important. Now, voices are essential in human communication. And I think one of the things that Willie-Jay does that perhaps Dick wouldn't be able to do is he's able to authentically connect to other humans by his honesty and his openness and his ability to speak, his ability to communicate. Now, the word glory here suggests a religious type of image, because this is someone who uses his voice to help improve, to share beauty. He doesn't use his voice to drag other people down. He doesn't use his voice to manipulate or to hurt like Dick does. And if you take a look at the really colloquial, quite coarse language that we see from Dick all the way through the text, he says some really horrific and quite vulgar things. This type of voice from Willie-Jay is much more respectful, much more religious, much more holy, and much more glorious in this case. Now, the point I'd like to make underneath is that Willie-Jay is able to change the views of Perry. So at first, Perry is contemptuous of any exhibition of piety. So Perry doesn't like people who try and be good people. He doesn't like people who lord themselves around as people who are better than others. But the word wonder there, the dynamic verb made him wonder, that suggests that Willie-Jay has the capacity to make Perry see the world slightly differently, to change his assertions, to change the way he sees things. And I think that's a really powerful skill for this character to have. Because if Willie-Jay is successful in making Perry look at the world slightly different, then he starts to solve a lot of Perry's problems. So the end here, it made him wonder a little at the justice of his contempt. He starts to question, maybe I don't hate all religious people. Maybe I don't hate all people who try and do good things. And I think the word made there is really important. It made him wonder. And I think the auxiliary verb made really shows that Willie-Jay is able to change Perry if he has enough time with him. And I think that's a really positive attribute. Eventually, prodded by a slightly alerted religious curiosity, he approached Willie-Jay and the chaplain's clerk, at once responsive, thought he divined in the triple-legged bodybuilder with the misty gaze and a prim, smoky voice, a poet, something rare and savable. An ambition to bring this boy to God engulfed him. His hopes of succeeding accelerated when one day Perry produced a pastel drawing he had made. A large, in no way technically naive portrait of Jesus. Lansing's Protestant chaplain, the Reverend James Post, so valued it that he hung it in his office, where it hangs still, a slick and pretty saviour, with Willie-Jay's full lips and grieving eyes. Where it says he approached Willie-Jay, this is the first time we see the distance between the two characters begin to disappear. Now, I would argue the dynamic verb approached shows that Perry is drawn to this man because he is seeking connection. We know that Perry is the type of person that is desperately looking for an identity, desperately looking for meaning or purpose or love, the type of love that was denied to him by the nuns who were supposed to look after him, or the sergeant in the merchant marines that neglected his duty, or or his parents who didn't show him the type of love that he needed. Now, what's most important here, I think, is when Willie-Jay is at once responsive. There is an immediate showing of love, or showing of respect, or showing of connection. So with Perry, when he seeks that connection in Willie-Jay, Willie-Jay is forthcoming with giving it to him. And it then says he thought he divined in the cripple-legged bodybuilder with the misty gaze. Now, the word divined here, there are connotations of being quite saintly, of being religion. Now, if he thought he divined, that's coming from Willie-Jay. Willie-Jay can see something. Now, he seems to be able to see value when others would see deformity. Now, I think that presents Willie-Jay as the type of person that can see beyond the superficial facade, the toxic masculinity, the bodybuilding, the over-muscled shape, and he's able to see what's actually inside. And then this very superficial description of cripple-legged bodybuilder, I think that's the image that other people might see. Now, that's a very physical description, and it is quite grotesque in its deformity. Both cripple-legged and bodybuilder are different types of deformity. Now, cripple-legged is something that Perry will never be able to escape. That is something that is done to him. But bodybuilder is something that he is deliberately doing to himself to change his identity, or change the way he's seen, or to attain a level of masculinity he'll be happy with. Now, what's really important is Willie-Jay sees both and then sees beyond both. He seems to have an understanding that is beyond the physical. He seems to be quite mystical. He's very intelligent, he's intellectual, but most important, he's this religious person who's able to see inside of people, and he isn't just masked by what's seen on the outside. I'd like to juxtapose that with Dick. When Dick sees Perry, he sees something he can use. A cold-blooded figure, a rare character that is able to do awful things with no conscience. And that's a tool that he can use to exploit and get what he wants. Now he also notices the misty gaze of the prim, smoky voice. Now the misty gaze presents Perry as someone removed from reality, someone whose eyes aren't seeing clearly, almost like there's clouds in his eyes. And I think that could reflect the fact that he lives in a dream world, that he's not quite happy with reality. He sees the world differently to other people. There seems to be a lens in front of his eyes. Now, I would probably argue that that lens in front of his eyes, the misty gaze, is a form of protection. Because of his horrific trauma from his childhood, he is deformed in the way he sees things. And I think what Willie-Jay sees is an opportunity to maybe give Perry clarity instead of having to look through his misty eyes. And what he sees that others don't is a poet, something rare and savable. Now, the noun poet, I think, has connotations of the ability to create beauty, the ability to communicate others, the ability of having something worthy of being listened to, but also real beauty and splendor and something quite profound. What Willie-Jay can see is the creativity and the individuality beneath the superficial facade of cripple-legged or bodybuilder. And then you get the post-modifying adjectives, rare and savable. Now, rare suggests value. He can see value inside of Perry when others see nothing but emptiness. And I think the word savable is really important, because savable means this is someone not beyond salvation. This is someone who could get redemption. This is someone with support and help, could be a productive member of society. And we see that all the way through the book. Perry at the end of the book felt like he had something to give, and maybe his life didn't have to turn out like this. With support, with stronger social services in the 1950s and the 1960s, when perhaps children weren't considered the property of parents to do what they want with and to bring up in whatever way they see fit. Perhaps with support, perhaps if society was different, perhaps this man wouldn't have ended up where he is. And then it tells us that Willie-Jay has an ambition. And I like the word ambition, because ambition suggests hope. Ambition suggests things can be better. Ambition suggests a mission. And what he wants to do is to bring this boy to God. And I think it's quite important that the word boy there, the noun boy, is used deliberately to present Perry as quite juvenile and quite infantile, and that he needs help and support and guidance in order to be able to be brought to a place of love and acceptance like in God. And the word engulfed, I think, links really well with the word ambition, because the dynamic verb engulfed, I think it shows that Willie-Jay has purpose. He knows exactly what his purpose in life is. It's to help like people like Perry. And he wants Perry to have a similar level of purpose and mission. Now, after that, it says his hopes of succeeding were accelerated. And if you take a look at how positive and hopeful the word hope is, his hopes, the abstract noun hopes, I think that shows that this is someone who looks at the positives, understands the dangers, but looks at the positives. And the word succeeding thinks that he can change Perry's life. He has this attitude of being able to complete missions and tasks, rather than pessimistically believing that people are beyond salvation. And I think that is different to how many people in the 1950s and 1960s felt towards the justice system. For a lot of people, they look at criminals and they write them off completely. They feel like they are infernal people who will never have any chance at rehabilitation, so they would much rather incarcerate them or dispose of them through execution. And I think Capote advocates for, perhaps it's time to consider why criminals act the way they act, and maybe even see if there's something we can do to help those people not reoffend. Because this is one of the first times that Perry goes to prison, but he goes to prison multiple times, which means prisons aren't deterrents for future crime. So the hopes and the succeeding part, I think seeing Willie-Jay being able to see positives in criminals gives them a chance to be better people and maybe contribute to the world. Whereas in the 1950s and the 1960s, there was more of a retributive type of justice. Once people have done something bad, we dispose of them and we write them off, and we don't give them any chance of saving themselves. Now, at the end of this small section, the word valued again appears, and this time it is referred to the image, the picture that is produced by Perry, because Perry creates an image of Jesus, and I don't think it's an accident that we get this biblical imagery of Jesus. And the fact that he uses Willie-Jay's full lips and grieving eyes in Jesus's complexion is because in Willie-Jay there is the hope of forgiveness, of help and support, like Jesus offered help and support and guidance. Picture was the climax of Perry's never very earnest spiritual quest, and, ironically, the termination of it. He adjudged his Jesus a piece of hypocrisy, an attempt to fool and betray Willie-Jay, for he was as unconvinced of God as ever. Yet should he admit this and risk forfeiting the one friend who had ever truly understood him? Hood, Joe, Jesse, travellers straying through a world where last names were seldom exchanged, these had been his buddies. Never anyone like Willie-Jay, who was in Perry's opinion way above average intellectually, perceptive as a well-trained psychologist. How was it possible that so gifted a man had wound up in Lansing? At the beginning of this section, it says, never very earnest spiritual quest. And I think this is quite important because this is an excuse that he created in order to get closer to Willie-Jay. He had no real decision to become a religious figure. His painting of Jesus was there purely to get closer to Willie-Jay, to start conversations with him, to impress him. Now, he hates the fact that he is not earnest, and his termination of his belief in God is because he is distrustful of religion. He's rejected religion. And I think one of the reasons why he rejects religion is because religion very clearly has rejected him. He's been given a life that is incredibly difficult. He was never really born with a chance because of his parents' mistreatment of him. And when faced with religious figures in his past, he has always been met with abuse and hatred. The section on the nuns and their physical abuse of him clearly show that religion has turned its back on him. So for Perry, he is resolved to never find meaning through religion. And yet, his motivation, this quest that he's mentioning, I think it's much more about becoming a little bit more acquainted with Willie-Jay. And whilst religion might not offer him salvation, there's a part of me that thinks perhaps a relationship with this man who offers him guidance and peace and love and support, perhaps that is where Perry is far more likely to find happiness, perhaps in the ability to be close to his fellow human. Now, where it says adjudged, he hates the fact that he has done something inauthentic. And then we get this lexical set of hypocrisy, fool, betray. There's definitely this attempt to trick, this attempt to present himself in a particular way, almost like putting a mask on so that he has an excuse to get closer to Willie-Jay. And I think he hates the fact that the motivations behind his artwork, they were pretending to be because he was considering Christianity, but secretly they were so that he could get closer to Willie-Jay. And perhaps during the 1950s and the 1960s, Perry felt like he needed an excuse to get closer to a man that perhaps is a little bit closer to him. However, it does tell us that he is unconvinced of God as ever, so he seems to be quite resolved in the fact that he won't find spiritual happiness through God. Now, the prefix un really shows that Perry is unlikely to be convinced of his actions. Now, it then says that he's actually really worried about forfeiting the one friend who had ever truly understood him. Now, the word forfeit means to give up. Now, what Perry battles with is, should he be honest to Willie-Jay and say that he's definitely not going to be a religious person, but he's also concerned that if he gives up this kind of charade that he might be religious, then he will also be giving up this person that he's going to become close with. Now, where it says truly understood, the adverb truly is really important because he finds real understanding and authenticity when with Willie-Jay. Now we then move on to this list, this asyndetic list of Hod, Joe, Jesse, travelers. Now this becomes a list of people that have been an acquaintance along the way and have never really given any intimacy. If anything, they've probably left him with less. These are acquaintances, not friends. Now there is a juxtaposition here between the number one and then the list of many to show that for Perry, he only needs one true friend in order to save his life. And up until this point, he's had many friends that haven't really offered him anything. And if you take a look at the lack of intimacy in these names, Hod, Joe, Jesse, and then you get the collective noun travelers. Travelers are people who move around constantly and therefore probably don't make really intimate relationships. They're just passing acquaintances. Now, travelers also don't really belong where they are. They're also looking for something, looking for some kind of feeling of belonging. And then if you take a look at the dynamic verb straying, through a world where last names were seldom exchanged, you've got this idea that Perry, like these people, are lost and that they're all looking for something meaningful. And Perry might have found something meaningful with Willie-Jay. Now, the word seldom is an adverb, a pre-modifying adverb of the verb exchanged. And then you get the colloquial term buddies. Now, instead of friends or companions, the word buddies as a colloquial collective noun seems a little superficial, a little lacking of meaning. Now, I think the real difference is the juxtaposition between the word buddies and friend. Now, the opinion of Perry towards Willie-Jay is that he is way above average intellectually, perceptive, as well as a well-trained psychologist. Now, he is presented as intelligent and wise, which we've talked about already, but I'd like to talk about the simile, perceptive as a well-trained psychologist. Now, the word perceptive means being able to see clearly, being able to see things for what they really are. And describing him as perceptive as a well-trained psychologist, again, well-trained, the compound adjective shows that this is someone of high levels of skill. But the word psychologist makes me think that in the 1950s and 1960s, there was an emerging understanding of psychology, but it hadn't been adopted by most of America at this point. Most people still considered treating people for what they've done rather than the motivations behind what they've done. Now, I think Willie-Jay embodies the idea of a psychologist, and that suggests that by understanding people, we can help. And in the 1950s and the 1960s, I don't think in the criminal justice system there was an attempt to understand. It was much more to deal justice and to punish. So for Willie-Jay, he really does embody this new age of thinking, this more psychologically aware age of thinking, where perhaps it's better to understand rather than to judge. And if we look at some of the laws that exist in Kansas at this time, like the M'Naughton rule didn't allow psychologists to actually explain their answers in court. All they were allowed to say was yes or no, and the jury would never actually hear the psychologist's analysis of the criminals like we see with Dick and Perry. And you might consider, had Perry's testimony stood, the psychologist's testimony stood, then perhaps the jury would have had a slightly more sympathetic view and not assigned him the death penalty. He then asks the question why someone as talented as this person became a prisoner himself. So we do get this idea that perhaps Willie-Jay also has things that he's working on. Perhaps he has made mistakes in his past too, and that he isn't perfect, but that he is also tormented by his sins, and he is having this purgatory type of life so that he can get to the place where he needs to be. That was what amazed Perry. The answer, which he knew but rejected as an evasion of the deeper, the human question, was plain to simpler minds. The chaplain's clerk, then 38, was a thief, a small-scale robber who over a period of 20 years had served sentences in 5 different states. Perry decided to speak out. He was sorry, but it was not for him. Heaven, hell, saints, divine mercy. And if Willie-Jay's affection was founded on the prospect of Perry's someday joining him at the foot of the cross, then he was deceived and their friendship false. A counterfeit, like the portrait. And we get this image of Willie-Jay. Willie-Jay is a thief. He's a criminal. He's made mistakes in his past too. And yet, Willie-Jay seems to embody this idea of forgiveness, and he is able to help other people rather than continue this cycle. Now, we get this idea that Willie-Jay is the type of person that wants other people not to continue making sins, whereas for Dick, when he's in prison, he is making plans to commit more and more crimes. And yet, Willie-Jay's behavior is repeated. He has done this many times in the past. Now, when it says Perry decided to speak out, he chooses to be honest with Willie-Jay. He doesn't suppress his feelings. He doesn't hide what he's thinking. And I think when it comes to Dick, he does hide what he's thinking, and he does lie to Dick. But we haven't got the lying to Willie-Jay. So, for example, with Dick, he's trying to impress him and look all. He's trying to look macho and he's trying to look masculine. So he tells Dick that he once killed a man with a bike chain. But with Willie-Jay, he chooses honesty. He chooses communication, and I think that's a really positive step forward for Perry, deciding to speak out. First of all, he's making the decision through the verb decided. And then the word speak, that dynamic verb speak, really does show that he chooses communication rather than bottling up his thoughts, his feelings, and his emotions. But what he's really doing here is he's also testing the friendship. He doesn't want to be seen as only useful because he could be an extra person going to church. He's rejecting religion outright because he wants Willie-Jay to choose him as a person, not just as another person in the congregation. He wants to be seen as an individual. Now, after that, we've got the asyndeton of heaven, hell, saints, divine mercy, and it really shows the lack of hope he sees in religion. He's not a particularly religious person, but he doesn't really believe in salvation. He doesn't really believe in mercy towards other people. He's quite vengeful with his parrot dream. And then it says that if Willie-Jay's affection was founded on the prospect of Perry's someday joining him at the foot of the cross, now he's really testing what the motivations are. Is he just a project for conversion, or is there genuine care? And the words joining him there, I think, show that is he meaningful, or is he just another person at the foot of the cross? And we then get this lexical set of distrust and deceit, because Perry wants to know what the motivations of Willie-Jay are. And they seem to be quite earnest motivations. So you've got the words deceived and false. You've got the fricative alliteration of friendship false, showing the distaste that Perry would have if he was being lied to or tricked or trying to be converted. And then he said a counterfeit, because what he doesn't want is a fake relationship. What he wants is someone who is honest and genuine. As usual, Willie-Jay understood. Disheartened, but not disenchanted, he had persisted in courting Perry's soul until the day of its possessor's parole and departure, on the eve of which he wrote Perry a farewell letter, whose last paragraph ran: "You are a man of extreme passion, a hungry man not quite sure where his appetite lies, a deeply frustrated man striving to project his individuality against a backdrop of rigid conformity. You exist in a half-world suspended between two superstructures, one self-expression and the other self-destruction. You are strong, but there is a flaw in your strength, and unless you learn to control it, the flaw will prove stronger than your strength and defeat you." Now what we've got is, even though Perry has told Willie-Jay that he will not be converted, Willie-Jay persists in their relationship. He continues because he genuinely feels intimacy towards Perry, and he's not just there to convert him. Now where it says Willie-Jay understood, it makes him sound like the type of character that actually thinks, that actually understands, that actually listens. And where it says persisted, it shows he's not going to give up. He's not going to abandon Perry. And I think this is an important point because throughout his life, he has been abandoned. Everyone he loved eventually moves away. They hurt him, they abuse him, they do awful things. For Willie-Jay, he seems to be someone who is there to support. And where it says he is courting Perry's soul, I think the abstract noun soul, which has religious and godly type imagery and connotations here, is because inside Perry, Willie-Jay sees something valuable and something good. The idea of a soul is this idea of good and evil. Now, for Willie-Jay, he doesn't see Perry's soul as completely and utterly corrupt. It might be corrupt now, but Willie-Jay sees the potential for salvation. And where it says not disheartened, but not disenchanted, you've got the juxtaposition of the two words. You've got the dental plosive alliteration, disheartened, disenchanted. You've also got the repetition of the prefix dis. Now what this shows is that even though he might have been disheartened, so he might have felt a little bit upset that he's not going to convert, he wasn't disenchanted. And the word disenchanted means that he's not going to give up. He still feels like it's worthy to fight for Perry's soul. And then we move on to the farewell letter. After all, letters are forms of communication. They're written communication this time. And I think Willie-Jay really does show us, as this, this kind of rookie psychologist type of character, that communication is absolutely essential, because genuine, open communication can be a way of resolving trauma, resolving problems, and leading yourself towards a better life. Now, where it says you are a man of extreme passion, the word extreme there, the pre-modifying adjective extreme, shows real danger. And then that linked with the pre-modifying adjective hungry, it really does create this image of a character who is looking for something, because a hungry person looks to satisfy their appetite or their feelings, their motivations. Now, the tragedy that Willie-Jay sees is that this is someone who is looking for purpose, but they don't know where or how to find it. Just like a hungry man who doesn't know where his appetite lies. He doesn't know how to feed that emptiness inside of him so that it is actually satisfied, so he can move into being a better person. And then that's continued into a third, which makes this a tripling, a deeply frustrated man. Now, all of those combine to show that Willie-Jay doesn't just diagnose Perry with a problem. Willie-Jay seems to understand that Perry is a very complex person with a very complex set of problems. So he's not oversimplifying the problem. Now, during this time, there were lots of people who were oversimplifying problems. In the 1950s and 1960s, there was a massive overprescription of drugs to deal with a whole load of problems, from depression all the way through to criminality. Again, for Willie-Jay, he looks to find out what the problem is before considering how to help, rather than to blanket prescribe drugs just to make the symptoms go away without dealing with the actual problem. And it then says that this is what he sees as Perry's problem. He is striving to project his individuality against a backdrop of rigid conformity. And this may refer to the really rigid social expectations. We've talked in the past about how Perry is trying to be something that maybe he isn't, in the same way that Capote was trying to, in his childhood perhaps, to meet societal expectations, even though clearly Capote was never going to be the all-American boy that his mother wanted him to be. Now, what this suggests is that there is a real tension between who Perry is and what he's trying to be. I think Willie-Jay is saying it would be better to embrace who you are rather than to try and be something you're told to be. Now, as Willie-Jay clearly seems to be quite an effeminate character, perhaps a homosexual, and he doesn't seem to hide it. The men in the prison seem to know that he has sexual preferences that maybe aren't the norm at the time. It shows that Willie-Jay perhaps has come to terms with who he is, and perhaps Perry would be better once he comes to terms with who he is. He then describes Perry as living in a half world. And then the word suspended. And what this suggests is that Perry seems to be stuck in between two things. He doesn't seem to live in the real world, but he's not yet lost to the fantasy world. He seems to be stuck in an in-between place. And I think this presents us as a character with two choices, two roads that he could go down. Now remember, at this point, Perry is not beyond salvation. He hasn't committed the horrific murders. So it's almost like there is choice ahead of him, but Perry doesn't understand where he actually is. Now the word suspended between two superstructures, one self-expression and the other self-destruction, show that he is trapped between two conflicting motivations. Now on the one hand, he has a real motivation to express himself, to show the world who he is. He wants to be an artist, he wants to be a musician, he wants to be valued. And yet on the other hand, the way he acts are in anger and frustration, and that pushes people away. Now what Willie-Jay seems to be presenting is that whilst you are acting in two completely composing ways, you're just going to hurt yourself. And where he says, you are strong, but there is a flaw in your strength, the complements strong and strength I think are really important, because again, he sees the value. He doesn't just see the problems, he sees the value inside of Perry. And he says, and unless you learn to control it, and I think that's a really important line. And then it says, the flaw will prove stronger than your strength and defeat you. Now, what Willie-Jay is suggesting is that he needs to come to terms with his feelings and emotions and the trauma of his past, because until he does, it is going to hurt him and cause damage and pain. Now, learn to control, I think, is really important. It suggests that Perry can change his life. He is not beyond salvation at all. He has a chance at redemption, but the words learn and control require effort and discipline. It isn't easy to learn, and it isn't easy to control your emotions. So what it suggests is that Perry could learn to be a better person. It's not just about the way you are born or what happens to you. You do have choice. And what I think he really wants him to do is to act with agency. Agency means the freedom to do what you want to do without the external motivations that tell you what to do. Now, learn to control is very important. The floor? Explosive emotional reaction out of all proportion to the occasion. Why? Why this unreasonable anger at the sight of others who are happy or content? This growing contempt for people and the desire to hurt them? All right, you think they're fools. You despise them because their morals, their happiness is the source of your frustration and resentment. But these are dreadful enemies you carry within yourself. In time, destructive as bullets. Mercifully, a bullet kills its victim. This other bacteria, permitted to age, does not kill a man, but leaves in its wake the hulk of a creature torn and twisted. There is still fire within his being, but it is kept alive by casting upon it faggots of scorn and hate. He may successfully accumulate, but he does not accumulate success, for he is his own enemy and is kept from truly enjoying his achievements. There is imagery of real volatility, real explosiveness, real damage in the pre-modifying adjective explosive. Now, in terms of explosive, we could probably consider this a very uncontrolled type of damage. Damage that will obliterate those people around him, those people he thinks are worthy, but also it will consume and it will burn himself too. So we've got this idea of self-destruction as well. Now, this is an emotional reaction. So clearly, this is a psychological reaction that is born out of the trauma of his past. And Willie-Jay is able to identify that frustration inside of him is out of proportion to the occasion. He can identify that Perry overreacts to the situations that he's placed into. Now, in terms of the pre-modifying adjective explosive, we get this idea that this is something that will consume him, burn him from the inside out. And he asks why this unreasonable anger? And I think it's important that you've got the prefix un at the beginning of reasonable, because what it shows is that Willie-Jay is able to be rational and calm and to identify the problem, but Perry is unable to see the unreasonable nature of his anger. And it seems to be that it's envy and it's frustration and it's jealousy that causes such anger, because we've got the juxtaposition of others who seem to have attained the American dream, who seem to have been able to attain self-actualization, happy and content, is really juxtaposed to the contempt that he feels for them. And there's a part of him that feels frustrated that he wasn't given such a chance to succeed. Remember, his background really didn't put him in a position where he was able to achieve at all. Now, Willie-Jay focuses on the fact that Perry believes them to be fools. And now we've got the words despise. And then we've got the reason for his anger. Their morals, their happiness, and that's what causes the frustration and the resentment. So here we've got these illusions of perfection, these images of absolute happiness, and the reason why he is so upset is because he compares himself to others, and he feels frustrated that he was never given a chance that other people might have. We then move on to some metaphorical language. Now, the metaphor being used is that this anger, this hatred inside of Perry is destructive as bullets. Now, that simile, destructive as bullets, shows that inside of Perry is something that is going to hurt other people, but also it's going to be hurting himself too. Now, the metaphor is they're described as dreadful enemies. Now, it seems to be that Perry sees enemies in other people, but what he should be doing is looking internally to find out what is acting against inside of his own body or inside of his own consciousness. Now, this very much places Willie-Jay as the kind of psychologist figure who wants to understand why he feels a particular way and also the consequences of leaving that trauma go unresolved. The fronted adverbial mercifully shows that Willie-Jay can see that the victims of Perry will be put out of their pain. The victims receive mercy because their pain is ended tragically in murder or death. But for Perry, those bullets are going to continue hurting him. He is the person who is going to hurt himself more. In taking vengeance out on other people, he's actually hurting himself. And we then move on to a slightly different metaphor. Instead of bullets this time, we then move on to describing this thing inside of Perry as a bacteria. Now this gives us this clear imagery of disease. It presents his trauma, his anger, his frustration as a cancerous organism, something that rots him, decays him from the inside out, and if left untreated, will kill the host. It creates a gangrenous quality, something that is going to fester. And what it shows is that his hatred is the thing that will end up hurting him. Now, the way to treat bacteria is through, first of all, medicine, but also through understanding where the bacteria came from in the first place. And there's a part of me that thinks with Willie-Jay, he isn't focused in just on what the solution to the bacteria would be, but it's how to prevent it from reinfecting as well. So what he gives us is this character who is not just focusing on getting rid of the symptoms or hiding them through the overprescription of drugs, but actually considering where that disease comes from, trying to understand it so that it can be prevented rather than hurt. Now, where it says permitted to age, the verb permitted shows that Perry is allowing that bacteria to fester. And what it will result in if it isn't treated is that he will turn into a creature, torn and twisted. Now, you've got the noun creature, which gives us this monstrous, deformed type of character. And then we've got the post-modifying adjectives torn and twisted with the dental plosive sound to really show how malformed Perry will become if he does not seek to resolve the trauma inside of him. Now we then move on to a description about how there is still fire within his being. Now that imagery of fire creates this sense of pain and suffering. After all, fire consumes, it destroys, it takes life away, it suffocates, it's poisonous and toxic and creates noxious gases. And most importantly, when it comes to the word fire, is it spreads. Now we've got this idea that the more hurt Perry is, the more he will take that frustration and anger out on others, which means that pain is simply going to multiply if it's not treated, if it's not dealt with. Now, the real sadness here is that that fire is going to be cast upon others. So not only is Perry going to feel the pain of his trauma, but he's going to pass that on to other people too. Now, at the end of this small little section, it says, he may successfully accumulate, but he does not accumulate success. Now, this is a link, I think, to some of the things that we've seen in Herb. So for Perry, he may accumulate. Now that could be wealth or things or objects or items. He might successfully accumulate, but the clear difference here where it says he does not accumulate success, and there's a chiasmus here because we've moved from successful to accumulate, and then we move from accumulate back to success. So the chiasmus here shows that he may be able to gain materially from using his anger and his hatred, but he will never gain true happiness or true success. And then the end of the sentence is, for he is his own enemy and is kept from truly enjoying his achievements. Willie Russell, almost biblically, it almost sounds like a prophet from the Bible or a religious text. And what it suggests is that the thing that denies him happiness will be the thing that he thinks he's going to use in order to gain that happiness. So it shows that Perry will always be locked out of satisfaction. He'll be denied satisfaction until he is able to resolve those things inside of him that seek destruction and pain. Perry, flattered to be the subject of this sermon, had let Dick read it, and Dick, who took a dim view of Willie-Jay, had called the letter Just more of Billy Graham Cracker's hooey, adding, faggots of scorn, he's the faggot. Of course, Perry had expected this reaction, and secretly he welcomed it, for his friendship with Dick, whom he had scarcely known until his final few months in Lansing, was an outgrowth of and counterbalance to the intensity of his admiration for the chaplain's clerk. Perhaps Dick was shallow, or even, as Willie-Jay claimed, a vicious blusterer. All the same, Dick was full of fun, and he was shrewd, a realist. He cut through things. There were no clouds in his head or straw in his hair. Moreover, unlike Willie-Jay, he was not critical of Perry's exotic aspirations. He was willing to listen, catch fire, share with him those visions of guaranteed treasure lurking in Mexican seas, Brazilian jungles. I think you can probably see the clear juxtaposition in the way that Dick speaks and the way that Willie-Jay speaks. Whilst Willie-Jay is very careful and meditative, and he thinks very carefully about the words he uses because he wants to offer support to Perry, for Dick he is instantly dismissive. And he uses these colloquial, coarse language choices like hooey, for example, and the term faggot deliberately used to disrespect the fact that Willie-Jay may be homosexual. And it's a massive comparison to Willie-Jay's respect and wisdom. Dick is someone who is there to hurt, whilst Willie-Jay is someone who is there to build up and help and to support. Now, we also find out that the reason why Perry is attracted to Dick is because he's a little bit different to Willie-Jay. And we see this competing motivation inside of Perry. He's both attracted to the wisdom of Willie-Jay, but he's also attracted to the danger and masculinity of Dick. Now, it really does seem that Dick is luring him towards criminality rather than salvation, whilst Willie-Jay is trying to do completely the opposite, which is to lure him away from criminality and towards salvation. Now, we then get the description of Dick as quite a superficial character. Now, the description of shallow shows that he seems to be simply a veneer, a persona, this masculine figure. And that's in juxtaposition with the compassionate nature of Willie-Jay, who really contemplates, who really thinks about what the right thing is to say. Now, describing him as a vicious blusterer begins this lexical set of pain and anger and aggression, and that comes clearly from the character of Dick. And then we find out why Perry is so attracted to Dick. We get the phrase, full of fun. Now, I think we've got the deliberate fricative alliteration there to show how tempted Perry is to be closer to Dick. After all, the term fun here really shows a sense of self-gratification. Dick is the type of person that does things for enjoyment, whilst Willie-Jay seems to do things because they're right or they're morally correct. So the fricative alliteration of full of fun shows this kind of wild attention that Perry is quite enjoying. And he's also described as shrewd and a realist. And then I think what's really interesting is the verb cut, because cut quite clearly is aggressive and destructive. And it shows that Dick and all of his temptations towards a life of enjoyment and a life of fun is actually really damaging. And it could really hurt Perry. And it says there's no clouds in his head or straw in his hair, making him also quite different to Perry. Now, I would argue that the imagery here becomes quite biblical, because Dick seems to embody this idea of Lucifer or the devil, this entity that is there to tempt people away from goodness into a life of mortal enjoyment, whilst Willie-Jay seems to occupy this angelic figure that's there to tempt him away from those temptations. So I think the religious imagery there is quite clear. And then as it approaches the end, it says, moreover, unlike Willie-Jay, he was not critical of Perry's exotic aspirations. Now, I think the pre-modifying adjective exotic there shows that the dreams that Perry has are not realistic. And I think Dick knows that they're not realistic at all. For Willie-Jay, he tries to show Perry that his dreams and aspirations aren't realistic and that he needs to perhaps find something in the real world that will make him happy. We know that Perry's dreams of sunken treasure is actually quite destructive because it lures him away from using hard work or talent or endeavor, and instead requires luck or anger or aggression to steal the American dream rather than to earn it. And when it says he was willing to listen and catch fire, I think what Dick does is he indulges Perry's fantasies and allows his dreams to catch fire. Now, whilst fire might be passionate and exotic and gives a sense of warmth, fire here is really destructive, and it spreads and it consumes. Now, I think Dick is willing to stoke the fire for his own personal means. He doesn't really mind if that fire actually consumes the host as well. When it says share with him those visions of guaranteed treasure, and I think the term visions there, which is an abstract noun here, shows that what he is imagining is not real. Now, Perry should be able to see that those are just visions, they're not reality, but he can't, and Dick exploits that. And it looks like the quotation guaranteed treasure comes from the character of Dick, and the pre-modifying adjective guaranteed is used in juxtaposition to the nature of treasure. Because treasure is something exotic, it is something that is found coincidentally, and for Dick to tell Perry that there is guaranteed treasure out there lurking in Mexican seas, I think is a way he manipulates Perry into believing that his dreams can come true with nothing more than just good luck. The term lurking, the verb there, is almost predatory. It's almost like the treasure out there is just waiting for him. But there's also something sinister about the fact that it might be lurking. And then I think the proper nouns Mexican and Brazilian again link in with that lexical set of exotic places that we've had in this section to show that it seems to be that happiness is always elsewhere. And for Perry, if happiness is always elsewhere, he's never actually going to be able to attain happiness. He might be able to go to Mexico, and he does later in the text, but he isn't able to actually attain the happiness that he was promised. Then we've got seas and jungles. They're both very natural pieces of imagery, but they're also very chaotic. And I think that's a suggestion that Perry is lured away from a potential life of happiness with Willie-Jay and into a more exciting, more adventurous type of life, which actually hurts him, which causes real damage. After Perry's parole, 4 months elapsed. Months of rattling around in a fifth-hand $100 Ford, rolling from Reno to Las Vegas, from Bellingham, Washington to Boole, Idaho. And it was in Boole, where he had found temporary work as a truck driver, that Dick's letter reached him. Friend P, came out in August, and after you left I met someone. You don't know him, but he put me on to something we could bring off beautiful. A cinch. The perfect score. Until then, Perry had not imagined that he would ever see Dick again, or Willie-Jay. But they had both been much in his thoughts, and especially the latter, who in memory had grown 10 feet tall, a grey-haired wise man haunting the hallways of his mind. You pursue the negative, Willie-Jay had informed him once, in one of his lectures. You want not to give a damn, to exist without responsibility, without faith or friends or warmth. Beginning of this section, you can see the sense of loss in Perry. He seems to be lost in a world that doesn't value him, and he lacks purpose. You've got rattling around, and you've got temporary work, and you've got the idea of being a migrant truck driver. What it shows is that when Perry is released from prison, whilst he might have had a sense of fraternity in prison, when he's left out into the world he has no purpose and he seems to lack belonging. And that's one of the characteristics that Dick is able to use to manipulate him. Now, the way he remembers Willie-Jay is increased over time, and he's almost deified to this godlike, Jesus-like figure, taller than an ordinary man and having this real sense of wisdom inside of him. And I think Willie-Jay here is presented as an antidote to the disease that he has inside of him. If Perry were to follow Willie-Jay, perhaps he'll be able to resolve his problems. And yet the temptation of Dick clearly is too much for him. We then hear Willie-Jay's voice once more, who offers him a solution to his destructive behaviours. And his suggestion is that to act in goodness rather than to act in vengeance is what will really improve him. And where it says you want not to give a damn, to exist without responsibility, without faith or friends or warmth, and the polysyndeton at the end of this line, faith or friends or warmth, show what Perry often pushes away. And I think that would be the solution to his problems if he were to accept faith, friends and warmth. And I would say Willie-Jay symbolizes all three of those things: faith, friends and warmth. In the solitary, comfortless course of his recent driftings, Perry had over and over again reviewed this indictment, and had decided it was unjust. He did give a damn, but who had ever given a damn about him? His father? Yes, up to a point. A girl or two, but that was a long story. No one else except Willie-Jay himself. And only Willie-Jay had ever recognized his worth, his potentialities, had acknowledged that he was not just an undersized, over-muscled half-breed, had seen him for all the moralizing as he saw himself: exceptional, rare, artistic. Again, you can see that language of emptiness and being lost and lacking purpose and lacking belonging in the solitary and comfortless and the word driftings as well. And then we also get this notion that Willie-Jay really does recognize worth and value. Now, for Willie-Jay, he sees that value to be drawn out and to be enjoyed, but with Dick, he recognizes that value, and that value there is to be exploited for his own gain, and then for him to dispose of Perry afterwards. The description that Perry is not just an undersized, over-muscled half-breed gives us this real contrast between the fact that he is physically diminutive, he is small, and the fact that he's tried to overcompensate for being too small by going to the gym and becoming much more muscled. It gives us this oxymoron of undersized and over-muscled, again to create this this almost grotesque, deformed type of character. Now you've got the juxtaposition of prefixes, we've got under and we've got over, and I think the undersized almost presents them psychologically being weak and over-muscled being physically powerful. And I think that's a really dangerous combination when someone perhaps doesn't have the mental faculties to control their physical strength. And the term half-breed shows again that this is someone who has a real fragmented identity, doesn't quite know who he is. And the final asyndeton here, exceptional, rare, artistic, that's a real lexical set of value and worth. And the fact that it's end focused shows that Willie Russell really sees the diamond that is inside the rough of Perry. In Willie-Jay, his vanity had found support, his sensibility shelter, and the 4-month exile from this high carrot appreciation had made it more alluring than any dream of buried gold. So when he received Dick's invitation and realized that the date Dick proposed for him coming to Kansas more or less coincided with the time of Willie-Jay's release, he knew what he must do. He drove to Las Vegas, sold his junk heap car, packed his collection of maps, old letters, manuscripts and books, and bought a ticket for a Greyhound bus. The metaphor at the beginning of this section can see that in Willie-Jay there is protection, warmth and belonging. After all, a shelter is something that provides warmth and it provides protection, something I don't think that Dick really offers him. He might offer him excitement and chaos, but Willie-Jay offers a place of protection and home. And you can see that it is made more alluring than any dream of buried gold. When Perry feels appreciated, he begins to let go of his dreams of a fanciful life. And I think that shows that Willie-Jay can really counter the temptations of fantasy and illusion, and he is able to pull Perry away from fantasy and back to a world that is actually possible. The journey's aftermath was up to fate. If things didn't work out with Willie-Jay, then he might consider Dick's proposition. As it turned out, the choice was between Dick and nothing. For when Perry's bus reached Kansas City on the evening of November the 12th, Willie-Jay, whom he'd been unable to advise of his going, had already left town. Left, in fact, only 5 hours earlier, from the same terminal at which Perry arrived. That much he had learned by telephoning the Reverend Mr. Post, who further discouraged him by declining to reveal his former clerk's exact destination. "He's headed east," the chaplain said, "to fine opportunities, a decent job, and a home with some good people who are willing to help him." And Perry, hanging up, had felt dizzy with anger and disappointment. We can see here that Perry didn't want to choose Dick's proposition. He wanted to be able to return to Willie-Jay so that he could find meaning. Now, when given an opportunity to act with agency, and it was a choice, he still didn't feel completely in control of his own destiny. And I think the term fate there, that abstract noun fate, really shows that he doesn't really feel like he has a real choice in this situation. Now, where we see the word dizzy, I think that symbolizes the loss of control. So when he is offered the solution to his problems and it's taken away from him purely by chance, he feels disorientated, like the feeling of feeling dizzy. And if that direction is taken away, then he is much more easily drawn away into temptation when he could have found meaning. But what, he wondered, when the anguish subsided, had he really expected from a reunion with Willie-Jay? Freedom had separated them. As free men, they had nothing in common. Were opposites, who could never have formed a team, certainly not one capable of embarking on the skin-diving, south-of-the-border adventures he and Dick had plotted. Nevertheless, if he had not missed Willie-Jay, if they could have been together for even an hour, Perry was quite convinced, just knew, that he would not now be loitering outside a hospital, waiting for Dick to emerge with a pair of black stockings. Now you can see, when he is rejected by his mentor, he then rejects his mentor. And it's a similar pattern with Perry. When Perry is treated with anger, then he treats others with anger too. And he rejects when he feels rejected. Now what he does then is he then finds the companionship in Dick, even though the companionship of Dick is a more nefarious, more toxic type of relationship. But that is a proxy for his companionship with Willie-Jay. What he really wanted is true meaning. And I think he is far more likely to find companionship with Willie-Jay. And instead here you get the term team. Now a team, it's almost an artificial creation where there is a mission to complete together. And in Dick, he finds common purpose, and that common purpose, unfortunately, is a life of crime. And then if you take a look at the way he describes his dreams, which once again he goes back to, you get lots of compound adjectives being used. And that really symbolizes that it is less rooted in reality. And I think that lexis of crime is really clear, the term plotted. And it shows that Perry is drawn to a life of criminality because other lives seem to have closed their doors to him. And that's one of the reasons why he ends up with Dick rather than a more healthy relationship with Willie-Jay. That brings us to the end of this section when we first hear about Willie-Jay properly. I'm hoping this has been really useful for you. It's a little longer than I wanted it to be, but we've gone into real depth in the character of Willie-Jay and how he seems to present friendship and possibility of salvation and redemption to Perry, and also the tragedy that by fate Perry wasn't able to return to Willie-Jay and instead went on a completely different trajectory. He went on the path that Dick went on rather than the more positive path that Willie-Jay offered.